Welcome to Pivot Points, a new series featuring some of the world's most successful women, candidly sharing their stories and insights about how they made it to the top and how you can too. Hosted by Perry Yeatman, a straight-talking global executive and award-winning author who created the career and life of her dreams and now wants to help other ambitious women do the same.
Welcome. This is Perry Yeatman, host of Pivot Points. My next guest is someone I just can't wait to introduce you to. I have only recently got to know her well, although I have known her for more than a decade. She has won nearly every PR industry award, rating, or ranking there is. And in 2016, she was named Latina Executive of the Year by Latina Style magazine. And I put the emphasis on style for a reason. Because despite a career spanning 2 decades in some of the most male-dominated industries and companies, including Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, this woman has earned the reputation as being smart, savvy, committed. She delivers, such that the boys have learned to say, "Don't let the high heels fool you." She is just a wonderful person and a wonderful professional, and I really think you're going to enjoy this interview. Catherine, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so humbling to be here. This is such an awesome project, and you're doing such an absolutely incredible job with it. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh. Okay, now you just made me feel fabulous. So, Catherine, I'm really excited you could be here because I know that there is a lot that our listeners can learn from you. And we know where you are because I just talked about that. But if you could help us understand, how did you really get your career off the ground? What was that kind of opportunity that you feel really made a difference, and how did you land it?
Well, it's interesting. I think my early career path is an example of what not to do. So let that be encouraging to everyone. But I actually came out of college in the late 80s into a very depressed South Louisiana economy. You really couldn't buy a job. And I worked briefly in television, which is what I wanted to do my whole life until I did it. And I learned that most women in front of a camera aged out at 30. And candidly, I also learned that I wasn't very telegenic either.
Oh, ouch.
Yes, that was difficult. After that, I went to work for social services because at the time I really thought of pursuing my MSW. And after a very disappointing 2 years, literally, Perry, 2 years without a single success story, I decided in the end that was not the right way to have impact if you really wanted to have impact. Mm-hmm. So then I quote-unquote launched into corporate communications, spending 5 years at a public company based in New Orleans, beginning as a copywriter and ending there as manager of community and media relations before I left to accept a gubernatorial appointment.
Wow, very cool. So it's kind of interesting that you went, TV, which is certainly, it's a media type role, but then to go from social services into a public company communications department. How did you manage that?
It's very interesting because while I really thought my passion was for helping others, what I learned was that you could channel that passion differently. It doesn't necessarily have to be your full-time day job. You need to use the skills and talents that you've been given and that you've cultivated over time. And for me, that was writing and working with the press.
Got it. Well, and that makes complete sense then. So, one of the things I think that it really, you said it at the beginning, but one of the things I want listeners to take away from that is you may think you know what you want to be, but very few of us actually get it right out of the gate. And so for most people, there's a bit of trial and error when you actually get into a real job to figure out what it is that you really want to do and what your skill set and your strengths and your passions really are. So that is not anormal or abnormal, rather. It is actually quite typical. So thank you for sharing that. So
well, and the good news is, if I may, the good news is that while I had all of these skills around editorial media relations, I still had the passion for helping others. And you'll get to a point in your career that once the work sort of speaks for itself, you'll be able to create opportunities to build those other things into the work. And that is very rewarding.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. So if I could, I want to jump ahead a little bit to kind of the mid-career period, which is where so many of us are juggling, and whether you're juggling work and kids, or whether you're juggling spouse, or whether you're juggling aging parents, the bottom line is that it's usually the toughest period for women, and a lot of us get to the point where we just throw in the towel. So what I wanted to ask you is, how did you navigate this period? How did you deal with the compromises and trade-offs in order to stay in and keep moving forward?
Well, it comes down to making some tough choices. But for us, the choice really wasn't children, because Brian and I never had children. So I don't know how much value I can add to that part of the conversation, other than to say I truly admire women who can do it all simultaneously, raise a family and build a remarkable career. And I will share with you, I was working at a company where we had a pilot women's forum, and I literally saw two women almost come to blows because one had taken time off to start a family and felt she was penalized because she had done that, because the other woman that she started with, who stayed on the fast track, was much further ahead of her by the time the woman who had children came back into the workforce. And both sides felt it was unfair to the other, if that makes sense. And rather than supporting each other, they kind of took it out on each other, which was so unfortunate and such a life lesson in that it's all about choices.
I agree. And it's all about your choices. It's not for any of us to determine what's right for another woman or another man. It's got
to judge.
Right, exactly. I couldn't agree more. That is one of the saddest stories that I have ever heard about women in the workforce, because the thing is, it really resonates. I bet it has happened a million times, and it's so sad. I mean, how are we going to get ahead if we continue to beat up each other, let alone try to figure out how to help everybody, men and women, get along and get ahead together? Jeez, that's tough.
I agree. And while I'm not quite sold on the whole concept of work-life balance, unless that means sometimes work wins and sometimes your family wins, and you make sure the least important one, which is hopefully work, doesn't suffer more than necessary, I've heard women who do this very, very well, Perry, and what they have told me is you can have it all, you just can't have it all at the same time. I think,
agree more.
Yes, I think there's quite a bit of truth to that. I had a job where I was literally spending 10 and a half months a year overseas some years, and if we had children, I couldn't have done that.
Can I ask, what were you doing that was requiring you to be 10 and a half months a year overseas?
I was with Lockheed Martin Aeronautics at the time, and I was, for a while, a one-person international communication shop. And then it became, okay, let's staff up a little bit, and I got 3 people, and I think when I left they hired 8 more. But they actually, at the end, said, look, you'll only go in when it's important. You'll only go in when it's a crisis. You'll only go in to troubleshoot. So you should be home much more often. This should work a lot better. It was the year I was gone the most. So best laid plans, right? It's all about execution and implementation. But they're a great company. They were wonderful to me. I had great career experience. But it's not fair to ask a spouse to be home alone 10 and a half months out of the year either. And that's where it comes down to. It's all about choices.
No, I completely agree with you, and that's a great example. It's an extreme example, but it's a very real example. So I thank you for sharing that. I want to also talk about scrutiny. Fair or not, and of course I would say it's not fair, as women move up, and I know you also happen to be a woman of Hispanic descent and Native American, I believe. So you have quite a mix in there. So I don't know whether that also added to your journey, but as you moved up, we are often scrutinized on everything from kind of looks to style to, this whole assertive versus aggressive thing, whatever you want to call it. And the question is, every one of us kind of has to find our own way of dealing with that. What was your way? How did you make it through this increased scrutiny?
It's fascinating you should ask this question, because I just actually learned something about myself just last week in this regard. I'll get to it in a minute, but let me talk around it a little bit. Until this job, I've worked in heavily male-dominated industries. Fisheries, aerospace and defense, this Aflac really is the first environment I've ever worked where the women outnumber the men. Maybe not throughout all levels of leadership, but definitely in the full population of employees. So I've never really been able to blend or hide. Case in point, and I'll share a couple of stories, and I promise I'll wind back to your point, but I was the youngest gubernatorial appointee in the state of Louisiana to run an agency since Reconstruction.
Wow.
Yeah, it was the Louisiana Seafood Promotion and Marketing Board, and I was called an executive director, which is the equivalent to an undersecretary in the hierarchy. So the 4 direct reports of the Secretary of Wildlife and Fisheries were the Undersecretary of Wildlife, the Undersecretary of Fisheries, and the Undersecretary of Wildlife and Fisheries, which was basically a chief of staff to the Secretary. And the Secretary made me report to him, which was a blessing because he had 2 daughters, and it served as quite a learning experience for both of us. And if you look at the family photo, what I'll call the family photo of our team, except for the chief of staff, all of the other men in the picture, and they were by and large very wonderful to me. Even if they didn't always know what to do with me, they were wonderful to me. But they looked like the guys in Duck Dynasty. And then they...
Sorry, I'm just trying to picture you with all the guys from Duck Dynasty. Okay. Listeners, you've got to go look at a picture of Catherine because she is about as non-Duck Dynasty as they get. Okay. Keep going.
Well, and it's so funny because there's always this running joke about my shoes. And Perry, you know me and you've met me and seen me well enough to know that I'm kind of a shoe person, and they're all ridiculously high heels, and I love shoes. We've all got to have our things. So my favorite moment in the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries was when the guys took me on the swamp tour, and we did the seaplanes, and we went out on airboats, and some of those guys, I'm not going to lie, did their best to try and make me ill. But not only did I not get sick, I did it all in 3-inch heels.
It was like the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers thing, right? You know, she did everything Fred did, but backwards and in heels.
And in high heels, yes. I love that quote. But I will tell you, Perry, after that, when I walked into a room, someone would always whisper, "Don't let the high heels fool you." I loved that. And ironically, we changed a lot of laws that made commercial fisheries much more sustainable, which protected the environment while simultaneously protecting commerce. Mm-hmm. And the most interesting thing about that particular initiative to change statute in every affected fishery state was that the 3 states with the most success in getting those laws changed, the 3 states that led the charge, were Florida, Virginia, and Louisiana, and they were the only 3 states with females in that role, and I think that's very telling.
I was going to say, need we say more to prove the point that society and organizations would benefit with more women at the top? Exactly. Well done.
I love it.
Well done.
But going back to your original question.
Oh, yeah, back to that.
Well, because it's going to be a bit revelatory, and I struggle to kind of get to that level of being personal, but the one about how I handle it, and like I said, I just learned this about myself, or I just had this revelation, because it was a habit that I clearly developed long ago, but I didn't realize. And I would cope with it by ignoring it, even though I was always aware of it. I realized I had never said out loud that there are gender discrepancies between men and women in the workplace that are scrutinized. I've never said that before last week.
Wow.
Now, I've never had a problem speaking honestly about it of others. When I was the GLBT executive sponsor at Raytheon, I had no problem acknowledging publicly that members of each diverse group, members of each ERG, we all have our own challenges, but it's difficult to talk about them in terms of yourself. And here I am with the Latina last name, being female and Native American, and for a long time I didn't talk about how different standards could be applied in the workforce based on gender, or frankly anything that affected me. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, every once in a while I'd have a moment, like when I was in aerospace and defense and traveling overseas. We talked about it, so it's a valid example. With a male in another department, I was a director, he was a manager. And he insisted on paying for the meal because, and this is a quote, the man was supposed to pay. That was a quote.
What century was he living in? Yeah, okay.
Well, It wasn't all he said prior to that, but I'm too diplomatic to disclose any more than that.
You're such a lady. I love that.
At any rate, I explained to him very clearly this was not a date, and that company policy said the senior ranking team member paid for working meals, and in this case, that would be me. Mm-hmm. But the lesson I've learned over time is that if I am a true diversity champion, I have to speak out on the issues that reflect myself as well, not just the ERG that I'm working with. If I'm really a diversity champion, I can't shy away from the tough conversations when they apply to how I personally identify, even though that personal revelation piece is difficult for me. But candidly, and finally, a very long answer to your very poignant question is early on in my career, I coped by ignoring it and just not talking about it, and I had to grow into it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm still learning.
Yeah, well, aren't we all? I mean, I think that first of all, I would say I think that your story is, well, I love it. It's not unique in the sense that a lot of us, particularly anybody who, not to age you, but myself being over 50, I think all of us had to a certain degree not only cope but ignore. Because if you got distracted by it, it just didn't do you any good. It was seen as a negative, and nobody was really, outwardly talking about this stuff. I also would say that one of the things that's very common that I've heard from a lot of women is that they will, and it's true, like we're just like mama bears, right? For those who are mothers, but it doesn't matter, mothers, sisters, daughters, anything. You will fight for your own like nobody's business, right? I mean, don't stand in between me and my daughter, because I will rip you to shreds if I'm trying to protect her. But it's very different when we have to advocate for ourselves. So what you said about the fact that you were very comfortable standing up and fighting for other people's rights when it came to the issues that were very specific to you, it was a lot harder. And I think that most women struggle with that. And we've got to figure out how to understand that fighting for ourselves is not about personal aggrandizement or, special treatment or whatever. Fighting for ourselves is how we fight for all of us. And I think that only by making that kind of mindset shift are we actually going to be able to motivate more women to do that, because a lot of women do. They just see that as kind of not the proper thing to do. They feel uncomfortable. They feel it brings more attention to them in a way they don't want. But if they saw it as fighting for, even when fighting for yourself is actually fighting for those behind you and beside you, then I think we would be much more likely and much more confident in going forward. And I think you still ignore the stuff that really doesn't matter, because to make a big deal out of everything doesn't really, that's not helpful either. But I think that when it does matter, then we have to be strong enough to stand up for ourselves as well as others.
I love the way you put that. Fighting for ourselves is fighting for others.
Yeah.
That is perfect.
Awesome. Okay, well, maybe you should be the interviewer, because you nailed it. Well done. Okay, I want to transition by talking about transitions. Even really confident, capable women can feel nervous or unsettled when they go to make a big change. So I know that you have changed organizations. Presumably you have changed geographies. When you go to make those transitions, do you have any specific advice or a playbook that you use in terms of how do you get yourself up for it and then ultimately make that transition successful, even if you do feel nervous or unsettled in the process?
Well, given that spectacular Super Bowl on Sunday, it seems like a football analogy is in order. Look, you can get out on the field and you can make the plays and make the plays happen, or you can give up and sit on the sidelines and complain. And basically, after Sunday, it's the difference between Troy Aikman calling Tom Brady the greatest of all times or the losing quarterback of the Super Bowl. It's your choice.
Oh, so well said. So well said.
Well, the winners are in the first group, and those who don't get in the game need to just stay out of the way. And I'll provide a real-world example, and I'll try and do it as diplomatically as possible, but you asked me when my real launch happened as a communications professional. It was when I took an assignment in aerospace and defense that caused me to live at the Sheraton Warsaw in Poland for 2 weeks a month for a year. Mm. It It was a lousy assignment, so much so that the corporate senior vice president and my business area VP, I was a director at the time, took me to lunch the day before I got on the airplane for the first time. They admitted it was a lousy assignment, that no one could turn this crisis around, and they would do what they could to salvage my career on the back end of it. And again, a quote.
So motivating.
Just what you want to hear, right? I was terrified, absolutely terrified. Interestingly, I did turn it around and ended up making a real name for myself. The other interesting thing was that no one else wanted that assignment going in. But after it was done, all I heard was, well, Catherine gets all the plum assignments. She gets all the good projects. The truth is, I got and I volunteered for all the rotten and impossible assignments, but performed so they turned into accolades. And while I'm grateful for the career success I've achieved, it hasn't been easy. Mm-hmm. But it would never have happened if I'd have been the one sitting on the sideline complaining that somebody else got the plum assignments. I got in the game, I worked hard, and I made success. So my advice is, in any transition, don't go timid. Don't sit on the bench. Get out in the game and make the plays.
Excellent advice. Excellent advice. And, it's so funny that this is something I didn't know we had in common. It wasn't every 23-year-old American female who was begging to move to Singapore in 1990 either. And there were even fewer who were apparently begging to go to Russia 3 years later. And it was exactly that. I was kind of like, what? This is not what I had as my life plan. But it was by doing things that either nobody else could or nobody else would. By, first of all, just saying yes. Even if I hadn't done brilliantly, I think just by the fact that I was willing to go for it probably would have helped me in my career. But like you, the fact that I went for it and then actually made something really positive happen because of it, it set me apart. And so from then on, if being, a 5'9" redhead with a relatively, out there personality and a big booming voice, if that was not enough to make me stand out, those other assignments were definitely what did. And I think that, not enough women do that, right? We do. We sit on the sidelines, or we say, gosh, I don't want to take the chance that I mess this up for the team, right? So it's like, if you take your football analogy, we're sitting there and the coach calls us in and we go, oh, but I haven't run that play that many times, or the last time I did it, it didn't go perfectly. And so maybe you should call that other guy because I don't want to drop the ball. Right? And it's like, no, if the coach believes you're good enough to get in there, you grab your helmet and you just go for all you got. And that's the best you can do. And that's all you can do.
Absolutely. So now, when you were in Singapore and Russia, was this before you had your family?
It was, actually. I worked in over 50 countries in my 20s, in my mid-20s to my mid-30s. And so it was all before I had kids and a husband. And literally, I chose, it's back to what you said about choices. I think that's exactly right. I realized at 36, it was actually my dad, I think, who said, honey, it's not that you're unmarriable, it's that you're never in town long enough for a second date. And I'm not sure, my husband might say I was unmarriable also, but the real point was that I made a conscious choice for personal reasons, a combination of my love life and my sister's little boy being ill and her needing help, to move back to America and to be much closer to my family. And I'd lived, and remember, this is before, there was no FaceTime. We had faxing when I started work, right? And I was lucky that when I lived in Asia, we got company email. Now, this is not the internet. This is not like everybody talking to everybody else. This was like I could communicate with the New York office once a week by email. And so I was really far away from my family for a whole decade. And so I made the conscious choice, and I thought I was actually really going to take a step backward in my career by doing this, because I had really had my choice of work after Russia. It was kind of like, whatever you want to do, my company said they would support me. So I thought I was taking a step backward. But as it turned out, it was one of the best moves I ever made, because I not only, within a year of getting back to the States, I found my husband. On the third date, I decided to marry him. And I told him that. And he didn't run for the door, so that was a good sign. And then I was blessed to have kids. I got an instant stepson who was about 9 at the time, and just a lovely young man. And then we had our younger one, my daughter, who is now 12. So I did all of that and then came back to the States. And so this, you said earlier, you believe that this whole work-life balance, I think the whole word balance is a complete misnomer, and I think we should kill that. But what it is, I think, is that you can have it all, but not at the same time. So I was not ready to be a mom all those 10 years where I was gallivanting around and, as like you were, 10 and a half months on the road, et cetera. I was a lousy partner, and I was not ready to be a mom. And I was just so blessed that kind of part consciously and part, just by luck, I moved back to the U.S. at the point where I still was able to have kids, and we were blessed to have one. And then, of course, I had also gotten a second one through marriage. So, yeah, all of that happened beforehand, which also I will tell you, women, for fearlessness. And then I'm going to get back to focus on you, Catherine, because this is really supposed to be about you. But I will say one other thing, which is I was completely and utterly fearless of everything right up until I had children. And now my husband will tell you, I worry about them constantly, right? And it's the funniest. People are like, who are you? What happened to that woman who just never worried about anything? And I think that I'm still fearless in my career, but oh my Lord, I can come up with 1,000 worry scenarios for each of my children on any given day. So I think that for me, it was the right thing to do all those wild and crazy things before I had kids, because I did have that spirit and that freedom and the focus. I was focused on my career for a good 15 years straight. And then I began to blend and figure out, how do I go back and forth? And I've been going back and forth for the past 15 years. And it's worked for me. But I wouldn't have been able to get where I got if I hadn't had that first 15 years where I really just focused on my career.
That's very powerful.
It was also a very long answer, so I apologize for that, but that's what I did, and I was lucky that it all worked. I want to talk about the executive level now. We often hear that it is lonely at the top, and frankly, even more so for women, because there's just so many fewer of us. So you got there, and you've stayed there, and you've been successful. How did you create a support system? What is it? Did you have a mentor or a sponsor? How did that all come together? Because, everybody has bad days. So how have you made it, and how have you stayed there?
That's an interesting follow-up given our last comments about the differences. And I will share that I have always been only one of 2 or 3 females on every leadership team I've been on until now. And I'll get to that in a moment. But in the past, it was very friendly and professional, and there may be someone you gravitated towards because they're busy with their jobs and their own families and trying to find that work-life, call it what you will, balance or not, it makes it challenging to really drive personal relationships inside your organization. Mm-hmm. At Aflac, we have 5 female SVPs. We have 2 female EVPs. It makes it much easier because the population is larger. And all are very generous with their time and advice. As a matter of fact, before doing this interview, I got a call this morning from our CIO, who's a female, and asked me what I was doing for lunch. We needed a therapy session to talk about a few challenges that we're both having and how do we get to resolution. She ordered sandwiches. I went to her office right before coming up here. So it's wonderful. Mm-hmm. But because it's difficult in a work environment, especially as you're working your way up, because people are having children, there are more demands on their time and that sort of thing, I've found for me supplementing my internal network with external peers, whether that's through things like the seminar, how we know each other, Page, the C50, volunteering, sitting on volunteer boards, phenomenal for me. I just get to be around so many business leaders who think differently and approach problems differently and learn so much, but it's also simultaneously building those relationships that kind of keep you going on a bad day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's so important, and I think what I would want listeners to take away from that is that you should do it within your organization, but you need to do it outside your organization too, and you've got to figure out what the right combination of people is for you, men and women, different levels. Some people say it's great to have it in the same industry. Some people prefer they be from a different industry. It doesn't matter, but it's about what works for you to get both professional and personal advice and support. Yep.
Right,
so,
Terry, if you pay attention, you can learn anywhere. And when you throw people into the mix, every engagement with a person, you can learn something valuable if you just pay attention.
Oh, what a great quote. If you pay attention, you can learn something anywhere. Given that every one of us needs to think with a growth mindset and needs to be thinking constantly about learning and evolving and improving, that is a great, great statement. Thank you for that. I want to talk now about something that may not have gone well. Like every successful woman I know, whether, we don't often talk about it, but the truth is that all of us either had some bad breaks or failures or been on the receiving end of, frankly, some pretty unacceptable behavior. Since it didn't block your rise to the top, I wondered if you would be willing to share with listeners a difficult or outrageous thing that happened to you, and how did you handle it?
Well, very interesting, again, because the difficult and the outrageous are where we get our biggest lessons.
Amen.
And I'm going to probably give you the most outrageous story you've ever heard. And because of that, there are several members of my family I'm not going to let listen to this podcast because they're going to die when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. But many years ago, I was literally told by a male peer that I should be grateful when anyone listened to me because I did not have a penis. True story.
No, did not say that actual word in the workforce.
It did, and it was meant to shame and embarrass me, and it was a horrible situation. And I will be candid, it took me years to be able to retell that story without getting upset.
Oh, I'm sure.
I'm kind of proud of myself. I'm doing it matter-of-factly now. I think I was more upset with myself than him because of the way I handled it at the time, which was just letting go because I was so angry and shocked that I kind of waited to the end of the day, went back to the hotel, and cried into a glass of wine by myself. I will tell you, today, that, I'll use the term loosely, gentleman, would get a very different response.
He'd be lucky to walk away with his teeth.
Well, and I'll tell you, I'll go so far as to say it's a response that is far too impolite to share here with you and your listeners. But yeah, what I found interesting was he was the one who was clearly out of line, and I was the one upset with myself because of how I handled it, which I tried to convince myself at the time was taking the high road instead of making the hard choice. Mm-hmm. So what I learned is you can always take the high road, and you should, but sometimes the high road involves making a tougher choice than you're willing to admit to yourself, and the tougher choice is sometimes calling people on inappropriate behavior,
yep.
Which is the hardest, right? I mean, if someone from a work perspective, if something is inaccurate, incorrect, boy, that's an easy fix. You just get the right answer, and you plug it in there. Everybody acknowledges, yep, we're moving forward. Soft skills are harder. They're much harder because it's so personal.
Yep, I agree. Well, and it's also because you kind of don't want to admit that actually can faze you, right? You kind of want to be able to say, like, who cares what you say? You're a jerk. I get it, and we're moving on, right? And not let it bother you. But the truth is, for most of us, that would be really disturbing and inappropriate and make us not want to work with that person, right? And if it was reversed, I would say that it would be exactly the same. And the truth is, it's just because it really never has been reversed, certainly not in America, right? Men have historically always had more of the senior positions than women. And so they are rarely, I'm not saying never for sure, but they are rarely on the receiving end of that kind of behavior. And while I think any man today would understand that is completely unacceptable, I think that a lot of the bias that women face today it's completely unconscious bias. These are good people. They don't mean to be biased, but they think they're being empathetic sometimes. I mean, they sometimes ask like this. I'll share a little story that I just love that somebody said in just a couple sentences. Woman coming back from her first maternity leave, and her first day in the office, and this was a guy who was trying to be truly supportive, like actually thought he was asking. He said, was it really hard to leave your baby to somebody else today? Right? Like, was it hard that they're going to make the choice that somebody else is going to parent your child? And she said, just like you, she didn't think of it fast enough at the time, but she said, boy, I wish what I could have said is, well, was it hard for you? Because every man makes that choice almost every day, right? It's like whether they're leaving it to their spouse or whether they're leaving it to a paid caregiver, most men are making the choice every day that they are going, to work and leaving the care and raising of their children to somebody else. And nobody asks a man, was that hard for you? And so it's just like, wow, we really just have this environment where people don't think or can't figure out how that will be received. And for men, I also think it's hard, right? I think there's a lot of men out there trying to do the right thing, and they're now like walking on eggshells, freaking out, trying to figure out what can I say, what can I not say. Whereas I think if we could just be respectful and transparent and just human with each other, it would all work out in the wash, because you know what the intent is behind somebody. So this woman basically said, to me that, she didn't hold it against the guy because so much because it was like she knew he wasn't trying to be mean, but it wasn't to say that she didn't go home on the first day of maternity leave. She didn't go, or after maternity leave, she didn't go home and cry about the fact that she had left her kid with somebody else. So anyway, It's tough. It's very tough. But thank you for sharing that, because I think not enough of us share these kinds of stories. And yet I don't know any one of us that didn't have at least a few of them. And young women need to know what they are going to face, and the fact that you can overcome these things. You can brush yourself off. Whatever's an appropriate response for you, you do that and you move on, because it's going to happen and you need to be ready for it. Okay, we're going to move into what I call the fun round. These are just some quick answers that I think they're not directly related to career advice as much as they are just kind of interesting for women to hear other women's points of views on. So the first one is, what one word would you use to describe your professional path so far, and why?
Jungle gym. It's not a career path. It's highs and lows and ups and downs and flying around and grabbing onto what you can grab onto some days, and eventually you make it to the top if you're persistent.
I love that. No one has said anything like that, and I love that. Alrighty. Okay, second question. Superpower roundtable. If you could have 3 to 5 women, I don't care whether you have them for drinks, dinner, breakfast, whatever you want, who would they be and why?
Okay, I'm assuming you mean living or dead.
Absolutely. It is a fair choice. Yep.
Great. So Condi Rice, who I've had the privilege of meeting with a few times, and she's one of the most brilliant sheroes that I've ever experienced spending time with. Mm-hmm. Lindy Boggs, if you don't know who she is, read her memoirs. They were actually written by someone else, but it's called Washington Through the Purple Veil, Memoirs of a Southern Woman. And she went to Washington in the late 1930s as the wife of a congressman. She's also Cokie Roberts' mother. And her son was Hale Boggs, who was, the biggest lobbyist in D.C. But she literally went to D.C. as a wife and mother when they had calling cards. On Monday, you would go and visit the members of Congress's wives, and Tuesday was the Supreme Court, and I'm making up the days, but you get the gist of it. That was her week. She ended up, after her husband tragically disappeared and is presumed dead in a plane crash over Alaska, in his congressional seat, which she continued to run for and kept for over 2 decades, serving the people of Louisiana beautifully. And then she ended up the first woman who was chair of the DNC. So phenomenal life story. But boy, we think, and we've picked on the guys a little bit here. I'm a little uncomfortable with that, because I do think, to your early point, everybody is well-intended. Everybody's trying to do their very, very best, and everybody's heart's in the right place for the most part. But if we think we've had some experiences in the workplace, you can only imagine what going from a 1939 situation where, when they would drive to Washington, because the nannies of the children or the household staff that came with them were African Americans, they couldn't stay in hotels even. They had to stay in other people's homes. And just how far we've come as a country and a nation, and this is not a fast answer, but it's just incredible. And I am so proud of America because women here have it better than any place else. I look at Japan, where 75% of our business is, yep. And we bring young women in the workforce over to the U.S. to meet us because, as I said before, Aflac has a phenomenal female leadership team here. And our chief accounting officer, her husband is a stay-at-home dad. The CIO I mentioned earlier that I had lunch with, she and her husband don't have children. Brian and I don't have children. Literally, when we get together with these young women and they ask us questions and to share our stories, first of all, they can't believe that we don't have children. And second of all, when June steps forward and says, and my husband is a house husband, he's home raising the 2 kids and I'm out working, their eyes become huge and they blurt out without fail, that would never happen in Japan. Mm-hmm. So we're doing great. Doesn't mean we can't do better, but boy, we're doing great. So my 5 women, Condi Rice, Lindy Boggs, Angela Merkel. I would like to also invite whoever may turn out to be the first female president of the United States, whoever would turn out to be the first female commissioner of the NFL, the last bastion, if you will. Mm-hmm. And if I could just go totally geek on you and say something completely corny, I guess I'd want to invite the women who've boldly gone where no woman has gone before. I think it would be great.
I think that sounds like a heck of a group. And I agree with you. And by the way, and I think anybody who knows me knows this, I happen to, despite the fact that, yes, you're right, we've been razzing on the boys a bit. The truth is, I love men. I love my husband. I love my son. I love... I have had, and it's interesting because I'm going to jump ahead to ask you the one question I haven't asked you. And I know that at one point you told me about this, like the best boss you ever had. And it happens to be a guy. And I will tell you that the same for me. Some of the best bosses I have had have been men. So just in case anybody's listening and thinking we're actually, male haters, that is absolutely not the case. The truth is that I have had amazing opportunities given to me, mostly by men, and amazing sponsors and mentors, and again, mostly men. So I am going to ask you that question, and I know, so if there was one boss, the best boss, who was it and why do you think they are the best, or they were the best?
Present company excluded, of course.
Of course.
Of course. It was actually a male. His name was John Jones. He was one of those rare bosses that made you not only a better leader, but a better person. He passed away suddenly and unexpectedly, or I'd likely still be working for him. The way he ran his leadership team was phenomenal. We joke about Camelot in memory, but he literally did have a round table, and every Monday morning at 9 a.m., all of his VPs would sit around at a table and hash out the really hard things. Everyone got a vote, and it was Raytheon. So my vote literally counted in his eyes with the same weight as the rocket scientist sitting next to me.
Not most people can say that.
Yeah, it is not hyperbole. It's really, I was often in a room full of rocket scientists. They didn't know what to do with me either. But he also believed in me. He gave me big, complex projects that were actually outside of the scope of communication. So I would learn more about the business, more about how to run a P&L and that sort of thing. And I never let him down because I thought so much of the faith and trust he placed in me that I wasn't going to fail to make him successful. And I still have a Christmas card. The company sends out company Christmas cards. He actually purchased this one personally in a store, and he wrote the kindest holiday message in it, noting that it's not my real card. He just thought it would make me smile. Aww. And it has a high heel shoe on the front.
But of course.
Of course, right? You'll see this is the theme. And it talks about how a little Christmas cheer is good for the soul. I have that card, Perry, in a place where I see it every morning. And it just reminds me not only to be a better leader than I was yesterday, but to also be a better person than I was the day before. And I am grateful to him for so many things.
Wow. Well, I don't think there can be any doubt that we both have a lot of respect for men, because that is a wonderful story, and he clearly was a wonderful boss. And I would just hope that every person listening to this podcast would ultimately end up with at least one boss like that, because it can make all the difference in your career. And hopefully early on. That would be the real dream, early on, so that you get a good start and that you know you can do it before everybody starts beating you up.
Or better yet, be that boss.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. When you have the chance, be that boss. Definitely. Definitely. All right. We're down to the last question. I'm very mindful of your time and listeners' time. So and what I like to say is, I give you a choice, but it's if you could do it all again, what advice would you give your younger self? Or what is the best piece of career advice you ever received?
Well, I was just asked this at the Top Women in PR luncheon, and the answer I came up with on the fly would probably work here. And what I told the audience was, be the person people want to work with, and you will ultimately be the person that everyone wants to work for.
Brilliantly said. Catherine, I can't think of a better way to end our time together on this interview. Thank you so much. Listeners, thank you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Perry.
You've been listening to Pivot Points, a series designed to help ambitious women have the careers and lives of their dreams. To hear more interviews, go to www.yourcareeryourterms.com. And be sure to tell us what